Mikie Sherrill defies the polls. This is the Issues Watch podcast. Hi, I'm Jeff Kazerman, Vice President of Government Relations at the New Jersey Society of CPAs, and welcome to the Issues Watch podcast. Contrary to almost every single poll, Congresswoman Mikie Sherrill beat her Republican challenger, Jack Ciattarelli, in the New Jersey governor's race by a whopping 13 points. Everyone was expecting a much tighter race. And also, contrary to expectations, the Democrats picked up at least 3 seats in the Assembly, where they now have a supermajority. Here today to discuss the recent election is my very good friend, Dr. Ben Dworkin. Ben is the director of the Rowan Institute for Public Policy and Citizenship at Rowan University. Welcome back, Ben.
Good to be with you, Jeff.
Glad you can make it. This must be the 80th time you've been on this show, but we've been friends for years, so that's great. So polls showed Mikie Sherrill with just a 2 to 4 point lead going into Election Day, and most pundits thought it was going to be a nail biter. I and everyone I know, except for one friend, thought the same. So how did she score such a knockout? What were the big issues and things she did right? What might have Jack Ciattarelli have done differently? And I will add, most of the time I heard, from pundits that she wasn't doing a good job on her campaign. But apparently that's either not true or it didn't matter. So how did she score such a knockout?
Okay, there was a lot there, so let me
I
try.
know.
Let me try and break it down. First of all, again, thank you for allowing me to be part of this. I think one theme that is emerging from in our analysis of this election is that the Republicans did quite well, but the Democrats did better, and that is the theme we continue to see. So, give you some examples of how Jack Ciattarelli, the Republican candidate for governor, did well. Jack Ciattarelli got 60,000 more votes than Phil Murphy did when he won for governor 4 years ago. He got 60,000 more votes. In fact, Jack Ciattarelli got more votes than anyone who has won the position of governor in New Jersey in over 50 years.
Wow.
And yet he still got blown out. We expected, I think a lot of people expected, and the polls seem to indicate this, we expected him to do better, to make this closer. You have to remember, Jack Ciattarelli has been running for this position and almost nothing else, meaning no other tasks, for a decade. He's been doing this for 10 years. He ran leading up to 2017, lost the primary to Kim Guadagno, lieutenant governor for Chris Christie. He went back with his team. He fixed the mistakes they made, and they came out roaring. 4 years later in 2021, he wins the nomination. He loses to Phil Murphy by just 3 points, a smaller than expected margin. He goes back with his team. He figures out what they did wrong, and they come back. So what we have here is Jack 3.0. That's what we really saw this year. And in contrast, Mikie Sherrill was a rookie. This was a 10-year veteran against a rookie. And so we thought he'd do better. Jack Ciattarelli had the straightforward change message. You're upset with Trenton, vote Republican. He won, actually, the people who thought he defined change. People saw him as more of a change than her. But it wasn't enough. Where he lost, according to the exit polls, were with people who thought she was more honest and trustworthy, thought she was more of a strong leader. She shared my values. She works for people like me. these were the areas where people identified with Mikie Sherrill more than Jack Ciattarelli. He had the change message, but it wasn't enough. We
Hmm.
look back at the June Eagleton poll from Rutgers University. It said 48% of New Jerseyans thought the state was going in the wrong direction. But it was just 48. That's a big number. But that's just 48. It wasn't 78%. And so when Jack Ciattarelli came forward with his campaign, he did very well. He talked about change. I am the change. 8 years of Democratic complete rule, the legislature and the governor. Time for a change. And it wasn't enough. What the Democrats did better was in 5 different areas. First, it was huge overall turnout, just massive. 4 years ago, 2.6 million people voted in the gubernatorial election of 2021. This time, people thought maybe it'd be 2.7, 2.8. We'll see it inches up a little bit. Certain Democrats had a goal of hitting 3 million total votes. We are fast approaching 3.3 million. We're well over 3.2. We're talking about going to a 48% voter turnout when it was 27%, I think, 4 years ago. The other reason why, look, this is the point about the overall turnout. There are more Democrats than Republicans in this state, 850,000 more Democrats than Republicans. So when turnout expands like that, there are a lot more Democrats who are coming to vote. Second area where Mikie Sherrill and the Democrats did better, the early vote. To remind people, there are 3 ways in which you can cast a ballot in New Jersey. You can vote by mail, what most of us grew up calling absentee ballots. You can vote by mail. You can vote early in person during a 10-day window at selected sites in each county. And you can vote traditionally between the hours of 6 a.m. and 8 p.m., 14 hours on election day. So what happened, again, excuse me, what happened was that the Democrats always overwhelm the Republicans in vote by mail. That has been something that's been going on for a while. But in the presidential race, the Republicans emphasize voting early in person. And the reason you want all these early votes is because it banks your votes. You don't have to worry about them. You can only, when you come down to those last critical hours on election day, you're focusing on a much smaller pool of targeted voters because all these other people have already voted for you. So what we have here is that the Democrats Democrats were just much more effective, not only in voting by mail as they traditionally are, but also early in-person voting. And by doing that on election day, by the time we got to election day, the Democrats had a 250 to 300,000 vote margin. The Republicans were in a hole statewide, which meant as long as the Democrats got 43 or so % of the vote on election day, which was not, particularly hard in this kind of election, they were going to win. The confidence of Democrats as they approached election day, because they had banked so much of the early vote, had been more effective than Republicans, who did better than they usually do, but the Democrats did better. Couple other things. I know it's a long answer, but it was a long question, so let me just.
That's true. I'll grant you that.
Look, Mikie Sherrill had message discipline. In a lot of places, in California, in New York City, we saw Democrats running for office, and they were talking about how bad Trump was. Whatever the outrage du jour was, that's what they were focused on. You got to vote for us, stand up to Trump. Mikie Sherrill didn't really do that. And this was, I think, really interesting. And to the degree that there's a lesson that other people in the future are going to take from this election in New Jersey, it's this. Mikie Sherrill focused on affordability exclusively. That was the issue she was primarily focused on. But she brought in Trump by blaming him for the affordability crisis. It is Trump's tariffs that are causing prices to rise. It is Trump's economic and social policies that are causing prices to rise and to making life more unaffordable here in New Jersey. Rather than talking about Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, Donald Trump is a threat to the republic. These are things we heard from other Democrats in other venues around the country, but not here. Here, you didn't hear that kind of message really until a lot of national Democrats in the last 2 weeks of the campaign showed up to just get the vote. When you had Obama, Amy Klobuchar, and other Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania, when these people came in, they were talking about Trump. They were just trying to rile up the base. But Sherrill and her campaign stayed focused and linked Trump to the affordability issue. Fourth thing that they did that really well, I think we're going to look at this as a new model for engaging urban voters. We saw astronomical turnout in urban areas. Margins well above that have ever showed up in a in a gubernatorial election year. Just as an example, 4 years ago, Essex County, base of Newark, Irvington, East Orange, a whole bunch of urban places, Essex County gave Phil Murphy in his reelection campaign about 80-some thousand vote plurality. He won by 80,000 votes. That's huge. I mean, that's just a big. This year, it was 120,000. It was astronomical, larger margins that were coming out of urban areas. So how did the Sherrill campaign do it? They engaged, they invested heavily in social media, in trying to get influencers, not politicians, to connect with and message and talk about why this campaign, this race was relevant to people in the Black community, in the Hispanic community, etc., in the urban communities primarily. That proved to be very, very effective. And the Trump gains of 2024, where we saw, wow, look at all these urban areas that used to give big margins to Democrats. Democrats still won, except for Passaic County, where Trump actually won back in 2024. Those margins, that shift was Trump's alone. It didn't transfer, and Sherrill was able to engage these folks. And finally, why did she win? Because of Trump. I mean, because this became a nationalized race, and in many ways, our politics in New Jersey has become nationalized. We used to think that New Jersey was different, right? Jeff, you and I, when we were coming up through the ranks, it was like, nobody gets Jersey. Only people from here know Jersey. We're different. Our politics are different. Mayors are more important than congressmen. There's all this stuff, all of which is basically still true, but we are nationalized. The fact is, you got to think of affordability was the boat that everybody was jumping on. Ciattarelli talked about affordability. Sherrill talked about affordability. That was the focus. But the current, the tide that pushed that boat to shore, that was Donald Trump. He affected a lot of different things. And that's, I think it made a massive difference in how this race turned out.
You know the lobbyist Dave Smith, I think. Well, he said
Of course.
either 2 years ago or 4 years ago, he predicted or said that it had already happened that, yeah, Trump does well in New Jersey, but it doesn't transfer over to other Republicans, which is pretty much exactly what happened here in the sense that Republicans did not do nearly as well as he did. What was that, a year or so ago? So I got to call up Dave and tell him he was very insightful there. So
we weren't sure. This is the point. We thought that there were lots of people. Dave Smith, a prominent contract lobbyist in Trenton, thought that, but you didn't know. Had Trump created something new? Were these Hispanic voters going to stay Republican because they were upset that the Democrats had become too radical in talking about social issues? Was that going? No one was quite sure until it happened. And now we saw, yes, those who said Trump's pull on the electorate is really Trump's alone, I think they were proven correct in this election.
Okay, so now that we have a pretty good idea of why and how Mikie won, can you give us some insight into why the polls were once again so off base?
Uh, Two reasons. First of all, with the caveat, I'm not a pollster. And so pollsters will be able to give you a better answer because they know what were the assumptions they made based on in order to do a sample and to say this is what the electorate is doing and thinking. Um, First of all, I don't think people expected this kind of turnout and this
Mm,
kind of Democratic turnout. And so when you take, hey, I'm polling 1,000 people, you're estimating how many should be Democrats, how many should be Republicans, how many should be lean Democrats, lean Republicans, but they're unaffiliated registered
right.
voters. That mix is based on past performances, past elections. That's how you predict. And you try to adjust them based on what you think is going to happen. I don't think anyone really predicted that we were going to have 3.2, 3.3 million people show up. So there was just this huge turnout, and that probably threw off all these polls. More writ large here, I think what we're talking about, there was an underappreciated no kings vote that was out there. People who went to those rallies around New Jersey, around the country, people who were upset on any number of things. They didn't care whether it was Mikie or Mikey. It did not matter. They wanted to send a message to Washington. The Sherrill campaign was their vehicle. And so they came out and voted. And it wasn't that, when we talked about the enthusiasm gap, which was again, a misreading of polls there, but it wasn't so much that there was less enthusiasm for her than him as much as the enthusiasm was just to vote Democratic, because there were a lot of people who showed up and just said, enough, this is my first chance to vote since the 2024 election. And that's basically it. Look, I think what we found out was that 10 months of Donald Trump was worse for a lot of people than 8 years of Phil Murphy. And they were going to vote that way.
Jack was endorsed by Trump during the primary. And he was running against a much more conservative candidate, Spadia, I guess is how you pronounce it. And Jack originally, 12 years ago, was pretty vocal in his opposition to Trump. And I guess he moderated that somewhat over the years, but he's basically never considered a good friend of Trump's. Um, but this time around, he obviously sought the endorsement and so on. My theory has always been he did that because he needed it to win in the primary. But once he did that, obviously he couldn't just get rid of it during the general election. So I know you've sort of touched on this, but how much of a factor do you think well, not only was he endorsed by Trump, but, I heard him say a bunch of positive things on the campaign trail. How much do you think that really hurt him, and how much better might he have done if he was never endorsed?
Look, in the primary, it was critical. Um, they were running, the Ciattarelli people were running against Bill Spadia, a radio broadcaster on New Jersey 101.5, had a strong audience and had gone out and really tried to secure the endorsement of the president. It's not that Jack Ciattarelli needed the endorsement in the primary to win, but he didn't want it to go to anybody else. And so he did enough in order to get that endorsement. When the president says you're 100% MAGA, nobody cares about whatever you said previously. And like a
Right.
lot of Republicans, national Republicans, the vice president, J.D. Vance, Lindsey
Yeah.
Graham from South Carolina, he has navigated the Republican Party's shift from Reagan Republicanism to Trumpism. Jack Ciattarelli once got up on a stage and called himself a country club Republican, but he, like a lot of other people, has navigated this shift in the party because so much of the base in the Republican Party in New Jersey and really around the country absolutely believe in Donald Trump. And they, even when they disagree on an issue here or there, they think that he is the strong leader that America needs. It is critical. And so you have to be part of it. You can't sit there and run against it as a never Trumper, the way State Senator John Bramnick did in the primary. So it was critical to Ciattarelli to get that endorsement. But then it was a bit of an albatross around his neck for the rest of the campaign. Trump did not come here. They did not have a rally together. They had a couple giant, telephone rallies where people called in to hear the president talk about how great Jack Ciattarelli was. The president obviously did some things on Truth Social to endorse Jack Ciattarelli, but more significantly, Jack Ciattarelli was simply tarred by whatever negative thing the president did. And so during the shutdown, as the president was getting blamed for the shutdown, as the focus in these final few weeks was about SNAP benefits, what we used to call food stamps, and the elimination, that's 800,000 people rely on that federal benefit. That's 270,000 kids who rely on that benefit, and they were getting cut off. And the Trump administration was going to the US Supreme Court to say the federal courts shouldn't be able to force us to spend this money. It didn't matter that Jack Ciattarelli said he disagreed, or it just, you are part of this. Another thing, the cancellation or the termination, in the words of the president, of the Gateway Tunnel project, a civic infrastructure project that is $16 billion, is going to cost $16 billion, and is critical to 10 to 15% of the national economy. Trains have to get through New Jersey into New York and up to New England. And you can't do it unless with tunnels that keep flooding as they did in Sandy. So this kind of project, which at least by most media accounts was put on hold, on hiatus, because of the president's personal back and forth with both Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leaders in the House of Representatives and the US Senate, respectively. And since they're both from New York, and this was a project for New York, it was put on hold. That hurt. I mean, we're talking about 72,000 jobs, union construction jobs that come from that project. You put that on hold, and it took Ciattarelli several days before he was able to just say, yeah, I disagree with the president on this. But then it was too late. One anecdotal thing I'll share about how Trump affected this race in terms of being negative for Jack Ciattarelli. I have students at Rowan University. They go out, they knock on doors. I've got a bunch who knocked on doors for Jack Ciattarelli, and a bunch who knocked on doors for Mikie Sherrill. When you talk to them, as I try to do, and ask them, what was it like? What was your experience in knocking on doors? What kind of response did you get? A bunch of the ones who voted, who were going to Democratic targeted doors, said, we were giving our pitch about why they should vote for Mikie Sherrill, and the person whose house we were knocking on, the targeted voter, wanted to talk about the destruction of the East Wing of the White House. That wasn't an issue in this campaign, but it was the kind of thing, that undercurrent that I think drove a lot of people. That really resonated with voters, even though the two candidates weren't talking about it. It had nothing to do with it, but it was part of it there. So yeah, he had, I think the president had a huge impact on this. And if you doubt that, let's just think of it this way. One last thing. Imagine Kamala Harris was president right now. If that were the case, I think Jack Ciattarelli, most people would predict in that kind of alternative universe, Jack Ciattarelli could have won this thing by 12 points himself.
Huh.
But she wasn't, and he is, and that made all the difference.
It's interesting you mentioned country club Republicans who used to, I think you would agree, certainly in New Jersey, dominated the Republican Party. And now many of them are not are never Trumpers, which leads into my next question. So here in New Jersey, as I was saying, the Republican Party has generally been considered moderate. And there's actually been a fair number of never Trumpers. I know personally a lot of Republicans who voted for Biden and Kamala. So what I'm wondering is, did these never Trumpers, did they jump parties in this election? I mean, vote Democrat, and were there a lot of other Republicans in New Jersey who may not have been never Trumpers, who voted Democrat? So, like, do you have any idea? Do people know what percentage of Republican voters went for Mikie?
Yeah. CNN did an exit poll. And so we actually have some data on this. And the number is 7%. 7% of Republican voters voted for Mikie Sherrill. Now, in
Okay.
contrast, nobody ever wins 100% of their party. But in
Yeah.
contrast, only 2%, 2% of Democratic voters who voted this year in 2025 voted for Jack Ciattarelli. So there was a block there. I would actually just push back also a little bit on the premise of your question. The anti-Trump vote among Republicans is smaller and smaller. When you look back, I mean, we saw it in the primary. John Bramnick, I referenced him earlier. John Bramnick, state senator, decidedly in the never Trumper camp, but a Republican, and disagrees with Democrats on a whole host of number of issues, but not a fan of the sitting president. John Bramnick ran. John Bramnick got 6% of the vote. Bill Spadia, who embraced the MAGA label, got 3 times as much. He got 22% of the vote, more than 3 times as much. He got over 100,000 votes. John Bramnick got something like, I don't know, 29,000, like that. It really, 22,000, it was a tiny number of people who said, yeah, I want be led by the never Trumper candidate. Our impressions, this is a very different party in New Jersey, the Republican Party, than it was under, say, Tom Kean in the 80s. And even under Christie Todd Whitman, who has grown so fed up with the Republican Party that she's no longer a Republican. This is a
Right.
two-term
Right.
Republican governor. So I think our assumptions about the moderation of New Jersey Republicans is limited to a handful of issues. The base of the party, however, is decidedly favorable to Trump. Even when they might disagree with him on an issue here or there, they would still vote for him.
Wow. Really? It's interesting. That has not personally been my impression. My impression has been that they will vote for other candidates who may have been endorsed by him or who, say they're MAGA, but that they still do not like Trump. But anyway, we'll put that aside. So one last question regarding, I'd like to know what your thoughts are regarding the widespread wins for the Democrats across the country. Are we just talking about a fluke or something you really can't count on as we go into next year's congressional elections? What are your thoughts?
Again, I think this election in 2025, almost everywhere there was an election. Virginia, New York City, here, California had a big referendum, and in other places, Pennsylvania had Supreme Court justices on the ballot, Wisconsin and other states. In every venue, we are looking at Democrats outperforming what they typically did, and it's largely being attributed to the nationalization of the election. This, in effect, became an initial referendum on the Trump presidency, and a lot of people who were upset with the current administration decided to come out and vote. Republicans did well. They didn't sit back. They didn't rest on their laurels. They absolutely ran solid campaigns, as you saw with Jack Ciattarelli. Did
Right.
extremely well. But
Yep.
there were so many more people who were ready to vote for the other side. And I think that was largely driven by the current national mood, which is
Mhm.
largely in opposition to the Trump presidency.
All right, Ben. Well, thank you for joining us again. I always welcome chatting with you. So
I
thank you.
appreciate it, Jeff.
Thanks for listening or watching. Please access our show notes for helpful links and resources.